I'd like to introduce Chris O'Brien, who works at Citibank. Chris, tell us a little bit about what you do.
Hi, thanks. Chris O'Brien, I work for Citi Ventures, based out of London.
Thanks. Now, you work for Citi Ventures, which is part of Citigroup, which is one of the biggest banks in the world. Like all banks, Citi is facing a whole bunch of new technological challenges, political, regulatory things going on, which make it very difficult to just keep on doing business as usual. You've got a nagging worry that things are going to get difficult for you. Tell us some of the different approaches Citi uses as a way of tapping into some of these new opportunities that are emerging.
Sure. Well, I'll speak to two that are close to Citi Ventures. So one is we invest in startups external to Citi, both for purposes of financial returns, but also strategic gain. So learning about what they're doing in the marketplace, finding areas where we can work with them to go to market or develop new propositions for clients together. The second is an internal program that I help manage called Discover 10X, where again, we try to take a startup or entrepreneurial approach to developing new propositions for the bank, ultimately to realize new growth opportunities for us in those constraints.
So let's focus in on Discover 10X, which is this unit that you're part of. The idea there, if I understood it correctly, is that a mid-level person with a bright idea can approach you and say, I'd like to see if I can develop this idea a little bit further. Can you tell us a little bit about what the steps that individual would go through to go from just some sort of crazy idea they've got in the back of their head to something which might actually have commercial value?
Yeah, sure. And to be clear, it could be any person, right? It doesn't have to be, it's rank immaterial. Yeah. But if somebody has an idea to solve a client or a customer pain point, and particularly if that's doing so would be fairly disruptive or a massive improvement relative to what the next best option is for that client or customer, we will potentially work with them, and they'll pitch to the heads of like the relevant business unit where that idea might sit, almost like Dragon's Den or Shark Tank, depending on where you are in the world. And then we invest in that person in three ways. One is they get a bit of time to work on that idea, which might start as very minimal at first, but then progress to much more as the idea becomes more real. The second is we give them a bit of money and funding to work on and develop that idea, maybe develop prototypes, talk to customers, et cetera. And the third is we pair them up with a mentor who's an entrepreneur in residence, so serial entrepreneurs, people with fairly deep product management experience in tech companies, or people who've been mentors at accelerators like Techstars or 500 Startups. And they coach the individuals through a process that looks like a stage-gated version of the lean startup, right? So this
and
idea...
just help us with the lean startup. This is a concept that came out of Silicon Valley, and it's a particular way of developing startup ventures.
Yeah, so about 5 years ago, a guy named Eric Ries came up with this concept of codifying startup success in a way that looks sort of like the scientific method, right? So rather than spending lots of money to build something and then put it in the market and find out that it doesn't work, we can make small experiments about the problem set at hand or the solution hypothesis and test those experiments with clients or customers and iterate off of them bigger and bigger and ultimately like testing our next riskiest assumptions about what it is we're doing to put them in the market.
And so over a period of months, this individual, this team of people would work with the mentor. They would develop their idea, start testing it out in very, very low risk ways to see if that idea has any sort of potential. And then at some point, presumably, there has to be a decision to actually invest a significant sum of money in that. How long would that process take? And roughly, give us a sense of numbers, roughly how many ideas might be kind of kicked around before you make one investment?
Well, so the investment is actually stage-gated as well. So at the beginning, the investment is about, are you coming into the program or not? And then, there might be another investment decision about, how much money, it's what do you need to run that experiment? What do you need to build a prototype and then go test it? And if the needs and the plan kind of make sense, then and all the validation about the idea so far, it looks promising, then there'll be another small tranche of funding. Eventually, when we go live, we're just scaling up that investment a bit more, but there's also a huge investment in effort in our industry to then get something like that.
And typically you're talking about 10 raw ideas to one go live business venture. I mean, something of that order of magnitude.
Yeah, I won't go into specifics on the numbers, but there's a like many other venturing activities, there's a funnel almost where the wide end is things that come in as origination or new ideas, and out the very narrow end are things that make it through. So yeah, I mean, ideas get killed off, ideas just we invalidate a lot, and we also want to celebrate those invalidations. So when we learn that something doesn't work, we want to hold that up for the rest of the bank as both a client or customer learning, and also an example of what what this idea of lean should look like.
And I realize you've only been going for a couple of years, so it may be too soon to say, but the end point is a business which obviously brings in its own revenues and it has its own activities, its own identity. Is the idea that these will then be spun out as separate units, separate companies, or will they become sort of part of the Citi system?
It's totally dependent on what the business and the idea or the new product is. And it could be a product very closely related to products that we already have, but in a new and disruptive way, and very likely that that would just stay with us.
Right. And as you say, depending on the strategic fit, it may or may not stay as part of Citi. A last question. And this is something we talked about before we started. The risk with many of these venturing type units is that you make these small investments and you even create a few small businesses which are successful. But Citi being billions of dollars in revenues, profits, that it's going to make no difference. Citi is such a huge company that even a few moderately successful startups won't matter. How do you think about that? I mean, what is the sort of strategic value of these types of little startups?
Yeah, so hopefully we put products into the market and many become successful, and we know some won't in the same way that most VCs work. That said, the other benefit to Citi with this program is that we're essentially creating a generation of entrepreneurs within the bank. And even when they invalidate their ideas and they go back to their day jobs and take that experience with them, they're bringing probably some of the most valuable experience someone could get, which is entrepreneurial experience, into how they work in their everyday business. And that is hopefully going to give that business unit or product line a real competitive edge in terms of their culture and their employees.
So there's a sort of a culture change part to this program, which, as you say, if you get hundreds and hundreds of people, that is actually enough to have an impact. And presumably there's also a kind of an insight piece, which is to say, as some of these emerging technologies take off, and Citi at the top starts to say, this is an area we've got to go into in a big way, you've actually developed some competence along the way as well. I assume that's a big part of the story as well.
Yeah, absolutely. So learning how to work in a more agile way, learning how to work in the way that many of the startups who are coming after the big banks' value chains, and even learning to work with those startups is massively important to us.
Got it. Thank you very much.